For years, Iran's Shahed drone was one of the most feared weapons on Earth. Cheap, deadly, and nearly impossible to fully stop, it helped level cities in Ukraine and terrorize ships in the Persian Gulf. Iran built its entire drone strategy around one simple idea: overwhelm your enemy with cheap machines faster than they can shoot them all down. Nobody in Tehran expected the United States to steal that exact playbook and then use it against them, but that is exactly what happened. On the opening night of this war, American forces launched a brand new weapon into Iranian airspace, one that had never been fired in combat before, not once, anywhere, by anyone. It was called Lucas, and here is the detail that should stop you cold. Lucas was not just inspired by Iran's own Shahed drone, it was built quite literally as a direct copy of it. The United States Air Force went looking for what officials described as an exact replica of the Iranian Shahed 136, handed the job to a small Arizona defense company, and then did something almost unheard of in modern military history. It took a weapon from first unveiling to full combat deployment in roughly 7 months. Compare that to how long it normally takes the Pentagon to field anything. Years. Sometimes a full decade. This happened in the time it takes to build a house, and when Central Command finally confirmed what had happened, the message they put out was almost taunting. These low-cost drones, they said, modeled after Iran's own Shahed drones, are now delivering American-made retribution. In plain English, the United States took Iran's own weapon, rebuilt it better, and fired it straight back at the country that invented it. So, how did a machine that barely existed a year earlier suddenly become one of the most consequential weapons of this entire war? Why did Iran, a country that has spent years perfecting this exact kind of drone warfare, seem caught completely off guard by its own strategy being used against it? And what happened in the weeks since that first strike that shows this weapon may be reshaping how America fights every future war, not just this one? Stick with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly what Lucas is, how it forced open a completely new kind of arms race in the middle of an active war, and why the moment American forces launched their own Shahed clone into Iranian skies may end up being remembered as one of the biggest turning points of this entire conflict. To really understand why this weapon matters, you have to go back to July of 2025. Months before a single shot had been fired in this current war. That summer, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth walked through the Pentagon's inner courtyard, where more than a dozen defense companies had set up displays, each one competing to sell the military on some new piece of equipment. Among them was a small Arizona-based company called SpectreWorks, showing off a low-cost attack drone they were calling Lucas, short for Low-Cost Uncrewed Combat Attack System. At the time, it was just one more prototype among many, a modular platform designed for strike missions, reconnaissance, and communication support, built with an open architecture that let operators quickly swap payloads and choose different launch methods, including firing it straight from a vehicle. Here is the detail that makes this story so unusual. Just 1 month after that Pentagon demonstration, the Air Force began actively searching for what it described, in its own language, as an exact replica of Iran's Shahed 136 drone. If that name sounds familiar, it should. The Shahed 136 is the same drone Russia has used by the thousands against Ukrainian cities. A slow-moving, propeller-driven, explosive-packed aircraft that is deadly, not because it is sophisticated, but because it is cheap enough to be launched in overwhelming numbers. Iran had spent years refining this weapon and exporting it to Russia, effectively becoming one of the most influential drone manufacturers in the world without ever needing an advanced air force to do it. The Pentagon's decision to go looking for its own version of that exact drone tells you everything about how seriously American planners were taking Iran's model of warfare. This was not an attempt to build something flashier or more advanced. It was a deliberate decision to copy the enemy's cheapest, most effective weapon, and figure out how to build it faster and better. From that request, Lucas moved from prototype to combat-ready weapon in roughly 7 months, a timeline defense analysts have since called almost unheard of by Pentagon standards. Retired Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Wayne Phelps, who has written extensively on drone warfare, pointed out that the cost difference alone makes Lucas a fundamentally different kind of weapon than what the American military has traditionally relied on. Compared to a Tomahawk cruise missile, which typically costs more than $2 million per unit, a low-cost drone like Lucas represents an entirely different philosophy of warfare, one built around volume and affordability rather than a small number of extremely expensive precision strikes. That distinction matters more than it might sound like at first. For decades, American military strategy leaned heavily on exactly the opposite approach. Fewer weapons, each one extraordinarily capable and extraordinarily expensive. But that approach runs into a brutal mathematical problem when you're facing an enemy that can produce thousands of cheap drones for a fraction of the cost. Analysts have pointed out that an Iranian Shahed drone costs somewhere around $35,000 to produce, while a single Patriot interceptor missile used to shoot one down can cost around $4 million. Do that math across a sustained air campaign, and you get an exchange rate that heavily favors the side throwing cheap weapons at the problem. Some estimates have placed that ratio as high as 114 to 1 in Iran's favor, meaning it could cost the United States over 100 times more to intercept a drone than it cost Iran to build and launch it in the first place. That is not a sustainable equation in a long war, and American planners knew it long before this conflict actually began. Lucas was built specifically to break that math. Rather than trying to outspend Iran's drone strategy with expensive interceptors, it flips the entire equation around, giving American forces their own cheap, expendable strike weapon that can be produced quickly and used in volume, without requiring a multi-million-dollar missile every time. That is precisely why analysts have described its deployment as a meaningful shift in Pentagon thinking, one that could eventually extend beyond this conflict into how the United States approaches drone warfare everywhere. Then came the night that turned this new weapon from a Pentagon prototype into a confirmed piece of history. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated surprise attack against Iran, an operation that came to be known as Operation Epic Fury. It targeted Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps command and control facilities, Iranian air defense systems, missile and drone launch sites, and military airfields across the country. And it marked the opening of what would become one of the most intense and sustained conflicts in the Middle East in decades. In the middle of that opening barrage, United States Central Command confirmed something that had never happened before in the history of American warfare. A specialized task force known as Scorpion Strike had used one-way attack drones in actual combat for the very first time, and the drone they used was Lucas. Admiral Brad Cooper, the head of Central Command, released a statement that made the significance of the moment unmistakable. These low-cost drones, he said, modeled after Iran's own Shahed drones, are now delivering American-made retribution. Read that sentence again, because it is doing something militaries almost never do publicly. It is openly acknowledging that the United States reverse-engineered its enemy's own weapon and used it against them, and it is framing that as a point of pride rather than something to downplay. In a separate comment, Cooper put it even more bluntly, saying these drones were originally an Iranian design and that American forces took them back to America, made them better, and fired them right back at Iran. That is about as direct a statement of intent as you will ever hear from a senior military commander, and it tells you this was never simply about building a cheap drone. It was about sending a message using the enemy's own playbook against them. Iran's response to that opening strike came almost immediately, and in a strange way, it reinforced exactly the point Central Command was making. According to a Central Command official who spoke to Defense One, Iran retaliated to the American strikes by launching a wave of its own Shahed drones directly at United States 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. A few of those drones did get through the base's defenses, though officials said they caused no casualties and only minimal damage, with the base remaining fully operational. Think about what that exchange actually represents. On the same night, in the same conflict, both sides were using nearly identical drones against each other, one built in Iran, one built in Arizona, based on Iran's own blueprint. It was, almost literally, the same weapon fired in both directions. That symmetry did not go unnoticed by defense journalists covering the war. One widely shared headline from Defense One summed up the moment perfectly, describing it as the Shahed drone meeting its own clone on the battlefield. It is a strange, almost poetic detail buried inside a very serious war. The idea that America's answer to one of Iran's most effective weapons was not to build something entirely new, but to simply take Iran's own idea, refine it, and hand it right back. As the war continued through the spring and into the summer, Lucas kept appearing in the reporting, not just as a historical first, but as an active, ongoing part of the American strike campaign. In March, Central Command's drone task force, Scorpion Strike, was formally moved into full operational status, a step that officials described as giving deployed forces a low cost, one-way attack drone capability specifically designed to multiply strike capacity, absorb losses without major cost, and overwhelm Iranian air defenses through sheer distributed volume. What stood out to industry analysts covering that announcement was the sheer speed of the timeline. The task force and its first squadron had only been publicly unveiled in December of 2025, and by March, it was already being described as fully operational, a pace one aerospace industry figure said should stop every Pentagon acquisition reformer in their tracks. In an institution famous for taking a decade or more to field new weapon systems, Lucas had gone from concept to combat-ready deployment in a matter of months. That speed became a talking point far beyond the immediate war itself. Analysts at Aerospace America and other defense publications began pointing to Lucas as a potential model for how the entire Pentagon procurement system could be restructured going forward, arguing that if a low-cost, effective weapon system could be fielded this quickly under wartime pressure, it raised serious questions about why peacetime weapons programs so often take years longer for far less urgent capabilities. Whether that pressure actually leads to lasting reform inside the defense acquisition system remains to be seen, but the war in Iran has already become, in the words of multiple outlets covering it, something close to a live proving ground for a new generation of American weapons. Lucas was not the only new weapon making its combat debut in this conflict, and understanding the others helps explain just how unusual this war has been from a technological standpoint. On March 4th, Central Command announced the first combat use of Lockheed Martin's precision strike missile, known as PRSM, describing it as providing what officials called an unrivaled deep strike capability. The PRSM is designed to eventually replace the older Army tactical missile system, and it can be fired from the same HIMARS launchers that have become globally famous through their use in Ukraine, as well as from the larger M270A2 multiple launch rocket system. It is capable of striking targets from roughly 250 miles away, guided by GPS, and its warhead is designed to fragment on impact for maximum damage against a wide area. Patrycja Bazilczyk, an analyst at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, described the PRSM's combat debut as signaling the beginning of a new chapter for Army strike capability, one built around significantly greater reach and accuracy than what came before it. Alongside the PRSM and Lucas, reporting also confirmed the debut of something called the Global Autonomous Reconnaissance Craft, or ARC, a system Central Command has not detailed extensively in public, but which appears to be part of a broader push toward autonomous, low-cost systems supporting the overall strike campaign. On the defensive side of the war, American forces have also been using experimental directed energy weapons for the first time in sustained combat, including laser systems known as Helios and Odin, alongside Israel's own Iron Beam laser system, all specifically employed to shoot down incoming Iranian drones without needing to expend expensive interceptor missiles. Layered alongside more familiar systems like Patriot missile batteries, THAAD anti-ballistic missile defenses, and the Navy's ship-based Aegis combat system, these new laser weapons represent an attempt to solve the exact same problem Lucas was built to address from the other direction, finding a way to intercept a massed drone or missile attack without bankrupting your own defense budget in the process. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something important about how this entire war has been fought. On one side of the ledger, the United States has been trying to make its offensive weapons cheaper and more expendable, exactly what Lucas represents. On the other side of the ledger, it has been trying to make its defensive intercepts cheaper as well, using experimental lasers instead of multi-million-dollar missiles wherever possible. Both efforts are aimed at the same underlying problem, the fact that Iran's entire military strategy, built around mass-produced, low-cost drones and missiles, was specifically designed to exploit the cost imbalance in older American systems. Iran's approach worked brilliantly against countries and defenses that were not built to handle that kind of volume. What this war has shown is that when the United States actually commits to matching that approach on its own terms, the cost equation Iran spent years building its strategy around starts to look a lot less favorable. Iran, for its part, has not simply absorbed these new weapons without response. Its own air defenses have continued to claim successes against Lucas specifically throughout the summer months. In mid-July, Iran's IRNA news agency reported that the Iranian Army's naval air defense systems had shot down a United States-made Lucas drone, releasing a photograph of what it described as the damaged aircraft, though outside outlets like Middle East Eye noted they could not independently verify the claim. Just days later, Iran International reported a separate and more detailed account describing how Iran's military said its air defenses had shot down a Lucas drone specifically over Bandar Abbas, a city that sits directly on the Strait of Hormuz, releasing footage it claimed showed a surface-to-air missile intercepting the drone in midair. Around that same time, Al Jazeera reported that Iran's Tasnim news agency described a Lucas drone being, in its words, accurately hit and shot down over that same city. These reports matter for an honest telling of this story because they show Lucas is not some invincible wonder weapon sailing through Iranian airspace unopposed. Iran does appear to have successfully intercepted at least some number of these drones over the course of the war, and it has been eager to publicize those successes as evidence that its air defenses remain capable, even after months of sustained American and Israeli strikes. What cannot be verified from outside reporting is the full scale of how many Lucas drones have actually been launched throughout this conflict, how many successfully struck their targets, and how many were shot down, since neither Central Command nor Iranian officials have released a complete verifiable accounting of that exchange. Responsible reporting on this story has to hold both of those facts at once: the confirmed historic significance of Lucas as America's first combat use of a Shahed-style drone, and the reality that Iran has continued to intercept at least some of them along the way. What is not in dispute is the broader strategic picture this entire episode fits into. Iran spent the 8 months between the war that erupted in June of 2025 and the one that began in February of 2026, rebuilding and reorganizing its own missile and drone infrastructure specifically to withstand exactly this kind of sustained American pressure. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi later said publicly that during those 8 months, Iran restructured its launcher systems in such a way that no matter how heavily it fired, its missile stockpiles would not simply run dry. That statement reflects a country that understood, long before February's strikes began, that it was heading into a war of attrition, one where the side that could sustain the highest volume of strikes over the longest period of time, at the lowest cost per strike, would ultimately hold the advantage. Lucas represents America's answer to that exact same insight, arrived at independently and built specifically to compete on Iran's own terms. Rather than relying purely on a smaller number of extremely expensive precision weapons, the United States built its own version of the cheap, mass-producible strike drone that has defined so much of modern warfare since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That war, often described as the first true drone war of the modern era, saw strike drones eventually account for somewhere between 60 and 70% of all hits on Russian targets by Ukrainian forces, according to figures cited by Ukrainian commanders earlier this year. The Iran conflict, arriving so soon afterward and adopting so many of the same lessons, has increasingly been described by defense analysts as the second drone war, a continuation of the same shift toward cheap, expendable, mass-produced weapons, reshaping how modern militaries actually fight. There is also a deeper irony sitting at the center of this entire story that is worth pulling out explicitly, because it says something about how quickly modern warfare can turn an enemy's greatest strength into a blueprint for their own undoing. Iran spent years building a reputation as one of the most influential drone powers in the world, exporting the Shahed design to Russia, watching it terrorize Ukrainian cities, and using it directly against American allies and shipping throughout the Gulf. That reputation was built entirely around the idea that cheap, numerous drones could overwhelm far more expensive and sophisticated defenses, a genuinely effective strategy that worked for years against multiple adversaries. What Iran likely did not fully anticipate was how directly and how quickly the United States would respond, not by trying to out-engineer that strategy with something more advanced and more expensive, but by simply copying it outright, building its own version faster than almost any weapon in recent Pentagon history, and using Iran's own design philosophy as a weapon against the country that pioneered it. That is really the heart of why this story matters beyond just the details of one drone program. It shows a genuine and rapid shift in how the world's most well-funded military is willing to think about warfare. For decades, American strategy was built around technological superiority, staying so far ahead in sophistication that sheer numbers from a less advanced adversary would never be enough to matter. Lucas represents at least a partial break from that assumption, an acknowledgement that in certain kinds of fights, being cheap and plentiful can matter just as much as being advanced and precise. If that lesson sticks with military planners beyond this specific war, and there are already signs from defense analysts that it will, it could end up shaping how the United States approaches conflicts against completely different adversaries for years to come, well beyond whatever ultimately happens between Washington and Tehran. None of that should be read as suggesting this war has become simple, or that new weapons alone are deciding its outcome. This remains a deeply complicated, multi-front conflict involving nuclear facilities, contested waterways, regional allies caught in the crossfire, and a death toll that includes Iran's own supreme leader. Lucas, PRSM, Garci, and the new laser defense systems are pieces of a much larger and far more complicated picture, not a simple story of one clever weapon winning a war on its own. Iran continues to demonstrate real capability, including successful intercepts of the very drones this story has focused on, and its own missile and drone production has proven far more resilient than early assessments predicted. Any narrative that suggests American technology alone has settled this conflict would be getting ahead of what the evidence actually supports. What can be said with real confidence, based on everything confirmed by Central Command, independent defense reporting, and Iran's own official statements, is this. A drone that did not exist as a fielded weapon a year before this war began became, on its opening night, one of the most symbolically significant weapons ever used by the United States military, precisely because of where its design came from. Built in direct response to Iran's own most effective weapon, fielded in a fraction of the time the Pentagon normally requires, and used to strike the very country whose technology inspired it, Lucas has become something closer to a case study than a footnote, an example of how quickly modern militaries can learn from, copy, and eventually turn an adversary's own strategy back against them. Whether Iran's own engineers are now working just as urgently on their next-generation response, adapting yet again the way Araghchi says they already did once during the pause between wars, is something only time and future reporting will reveal. What is already clear is that this war has become far more than a story about airstrikes and ceasefires. It has become a live demonstration of how fast an arms race can move once both sides realize the old rules about cost, scale, and technological superiority no longer guarantee who actually wins. We will continue tracking every verified development in this story as it unfolds, because a shift this significant in how modern wars are actually fought deserves careful, fact-based coverage. And if that is the kind of reporting you value, consider staying subscribed, because the next weapon to make its combat debut in this war may end up mattering just as much as this one already has.